In the autumn of 1915, on November the 30th, the ground beneath the most powerful estate in Delaware shook. Not for the first time. The packing house of the DuPont powder mills erupted in a fireball that killed 30 workers. Many of them were among the youngest employees on the property. Some were barely teenagers. When the smoke cleared, investigators and journalists descended on the Brandywine Creek Valley for the first time in decades. And what they found wasn't just wreckage. They found evidence of a world that the DuPont family had built deliberately, systematically, over more than a century, directly beneath their mansion. Hidden in plain sight. Hidden, in some cases, literally underground. 7 discoveries. Some were architectural, some were buried in company records. Some were written in stone walls, designed not to keep people out, but to direct explosions away from one specific building, the family home on the hill, 200 feet above where 30 men had just died. This is the story of what was found under the DuPont estate in 1915, and what it tells us about who the DuPonts really were, and how power actually operates when no one is watching. Number 1. The house that was never supposed to survive. He built his home to outlive the explosion, not to prevent it. Most people assume that the patriarch of a great industrial dynasty builds his home away from the danger. That is the reasonable assumption. That is the wrong assumption. When Eleuthère Irénée DuPont purchased 95 acres along the Brandywine Creek in Delaware in 1802, he did not build his mansion as far from the powder mills as the land would allow. He built it 200 feet away, on a hill directly overlooking the most dangerous gunpowder manufacturing operation in the young United States, and he did it on purpose. The logic, on the surface, was managerial. He wanted to watch over his workers, to be present, to lead by proximity, and he did lead. E.I. DuPont was known to walk the mills daily. He knew his workers' names. He went into the dangerous rooms himself. But what investigators and engineers examining the estate in the aftermath of the 1915 explosion noticed was something different. Something architectural, something that told a colder story than personal courage. Every single mill building on the Brandywine, every room where black powder was mixed, dried, pressed, and packed was constructed the same way. 3 walls were made of thick, reinforced stone, walls that could redirect a shockwave, walls that could contain and channel the force of an explosion. The 4th wall, always the 4th wall, was wood, light wood, intentionally weak, and it always faced one direction. The Brandywine River. When a mill detonated, the explosion did not scatter randomly. It was funneled by the stone walls toward the wooden 4th wall, punched through it, and blew out across the water, away from the other mills, away from the storage houses, and away from the mansion on the hill. This wasn't just engineering. This was choreography. The DuPonts had designed a landscape where explosions had a predetermined direction, where the violence of the work was not eliminated, it was aimed. The house survived every major explosion between 1802 and 1921, not because it was far away, because the explosions were never allowed to reach it. When the 1915 investigators first published their observations and technical reports, they described it with measured professional language. But what they had found, beneath the surface of the estate's elegant image, was something that would become a signature of industrial power for the next century. The comfort of the ownership class, preserved not by distance from danger, but by engineering the danger to flow in another direction entirely. The men in the packing house on November 30th, 1915, did not die because something went wrong. They died because that is where they were supposed to be. If the first discovery was about architecture, about how the family home was protected, the second was about what was hidden beneath a different estate entirely, built by a different DuPont, for a different kind of war. Number 2. The underground world at Nemours. A 77-room mansion, and a second world beneath it. Not all discoveries happen in rubble. While the 1915 explosion drew attention to the old Eleuthérian Nemours Estate on the Brandywine, journalists and social commentators of the era were simultaneously beginning to scrutinize the newest, most extravagant symbol of DuPont power, the Nemours Estate, completed just 5 years earlier, in 1910. Alfred I of DuPont had built Nemours as a gift for his second wife, Alicia. 77 rooms, 300 acres of land enclosed by a 9-foot wall. The mansion was designed by Carrère and Hastings, the same architects who designed the New York Public Library, in the Louis XVI style of French aristocracy. It was, by any measure, one of the most elaborate private residences constructed in America during the Gilded Age, and it had a secret that was hiding in plain sight, because it was hidden underground. Below the mansion's marble floors and silk-lined walls was a complete second world, a mechanical basement that, in 1910, contained technology that most Americans would not see for another decade. Electrical systems powering the entire estate. Early refrigeration units. A central heating plant sophisticated enough for a small city. But those were the systems the engineers expected. What no casual visitor, no reporter, no society columnist ever saw was the tunnel. A dedicated underground passage connected the main mansion directly to the estate's laundry building. It was not a utility corridor. It was a designed invisibility system. Servants who moved between the two buildings, carrying linens, uniforms, tablecloths fresh from washing, never had to appear on the grounds, never had to be seen crossing the lawn, never had to interrupt the visual perfection of the estate's surface. Below the main house, accessible through hidden service doors, the basement also contained a wood-paneled bowling alley and a billiards room. Entertainment, hidden underground, for when the family wished to be somewhere the guests were not. In 1915, none of this was secret in the sense of being classified. The family knew. The servants certainly knew. But the world outside the 9-foot wall did not, and when the 1915 explosion forced public attention back onto the entire DuPont operation. The mills, the mansions, the men who died making black powder for American industry. Journalists began asking a different question. Not, what is inside the Nemours Estate? But, what is the connection between the world above ground and the world below it? The answer, once you see it, cannot be unseen. The underground tunnel at Nemours existed to make servants invisible. The mill architecture at Eleutherian Mills existed to make the danger of gunpowder invisible, to direct it away, not to eliminate it. The entire DuPont system, from the founding of the company in 1802 to the height of its power in 1915, operated on the same single principle. What happens below the surface is kept below the surface. What appears above it remains beautiful. It was not hypocrisy. It was design. But what was truly buried? Not in stone tunnels or mechanical basements, but in company ledgers locked in fireproof rooms, was the most astonishing record ever kept by an American industrial family. A record that, once recovered from the wreckage of 1915, revealed something no one was prepared to see. Number 3. The ledger of 288 explosions. They recorded every death, every one. Here's a number, 288. That is the number of explosions recorded at the DuPont powder mills along the Brandywine Creek between 1802 and 1921. 119 years of making black powder, 288 times the ground shook, the wooden walls gave way, and men were found in pieces or not found at all. Here's another number, 228. 228, that is the number of workers who died in those explosions over those 119 years. And here is the fact that, in 1915, investigators discovered when they accessed the DuPont company's internal records in the aftermath of the packing house disaster. The company had documented every single one, not just the date and the casualty count. The records, preserved in the Hagley archives and later studied by historians, included explosion reports, structural damage assessments, worker identification, cause analysis, and in many cases, detailed accounts of what was found when the smoke cleared. The DuPont family had maintained, for over a century, one of the most complete private records of industrial disaster in the history of American business. Why? The most cynical interpretation is administrative. A company that deals in explosive materials needs to track what caused each failure to prevent the next one. The records are, in this reading, operational documents. But there is another interpretation, one that the powder mill workers and their families understood in their bones, even if they never articulated it in the language of corporate governance. The DuPonts recorded every death because they were the owners, because the records were their records, because keeping the ledger meant they controlled the ledger. And in 1915, when the newspapers began asking how many times this had happened before, the answer was in a room that only the family could access. 288 explosions, 228 dead, 119 years. And for most of those years, those numbers lived in fireproof boxes in the estate's counting house, visible only to the people who had decided they were worth writing down and invisible to everyone else. The 1915 explosion killed 30 people. It was the second deadliest in the company's history. The deadliest had been in 1818, when an explosion was felt 40 miles away and killed 34 workers. E.I. DuPont's wife was seriously injured in the 1818 explosion. The shockwave reached the mansion on the hill. Even a choreographed blast sometimes does not stay in its lane. But the ledger did not only contain explosions. It contained something else. Something that, in 1915, looked like generosity, and in another light, looked like control. Number 4. The company that owned everything. They didn't just employ the workers. They owned their world. In 1915, when a powder mill worker in the Brandywine Valley died in an explosion, his family did not face only grief. They faced a housing crisis, because the house they lived in was not their house. It belonged to the DuPont company. The land it sat on belonged to the DuPont company. The school their children attended was funded by the DuPont company. The church some of them worshipped and existed on DuPont land. The company town along the Brandywine was one of the most total examples of employer control over worker life in American industrial history. Workers and their families lived in villages and individual homes on DuPont property, paying rent to the company, sending their children to company-supported schools, existing within a geography whose boundaries were set by the family that employed them. The 1890 explosion destroyed dozens of workers' homes. The 1915 explosion leveled what had been rebuilt. Each time the ground shook, the company that employed the workers also owned the homes they returned to, or couldn't. The DuPont response to this was not to divest from worker housing, it was to maintain it as a permanent part of the operating structure. Workers received pensions, not because the law required them to, but because the DuPonts chose to provide them. Widows of men killed in explosions were given ongoing payments. Orphaned children were housed and educated. This was, by the standards of 1915, extraordinarily progressive. Most American industrial employers of the era provided nothing. They hired workers, and when those workers died in their factories, the job opening was posted the following Monday. The DuPonts paid the widows, they kept the children in school, they maintained the graves, but they also kept the houses, the land, the records. What investigators in 1915 found when they examined the full extent of the DuPont property along the Brandywine was a community in which the welfare of the workers and the ownership of their lives were inseparably entangled. The company was not merely the employer, it was the landlord, the pension fund, the school board, and the cemetery committee. When you provided housing, education, pensions, and burial plots, but the land itself never left your name, what you had built was not a factory. It was a dependency. And dependency, unlike wages, could not be withdrawn from. This was the world underneath the DuPont estate. Not tunnels, not vaults. People, whose entire existence had been constructed within the property lines of one family's land. And then there was the room no one was supposed to remember. The room where one of the DuPonts himself died, and the way the company handled it revealed something about the family that no ledger could contain. Number 5, the room where Alexis DuPont died. He wasn't a worker, he was a DuPont. It happened anyway. On July 10th, 1857, Alexis Irénée DuPont walked into one of the powder mills on the Brandywine. He was a member of the family. He was not just watching, he was working. Something went wrong. Exactly what? A spark, a friction, a moment's inattention was never fully determined. An explosion triggered in the mill. Alexis DuPont was killed. So were 6 workers who were with him. 7 dead. One of them bearing the name of the estate on which they died. The DuPont family did not hide this event. It is recorded in their own historical chronology. It is listed in the Hagley archives, accessible to researchers today. The grave of Alexis Irénée DuPont is in the family cemetery on the Brandywine property. But there is something that the historical record captures only obliquely, and which the physical evidence of the estate tells more directly. The mill building where Alexis died was not demolished. It was not cordoned off and turned into a monument. It was, after the appropriate period of mourning, after the inventory and the structural assessment, repaired and returned to operation. Production resumed. Because the powder mill was not just a memorial, it was a business. And the business required continuous operation during a period of American expansion. Canals, roads, railways, and eventually civil war that consumed black powder in quantities that kept the Brandywine mills running 6 days a week. When journalists in 1915 began investigating the history of explosions on the property, they encountered the story of Alexis DuPont in the company's own records. They noted the date, the casualties, the resumption of work. And they noticed something that the official family narrative did not emphasize. The 6 workers who died with Alexis on July 10, 1857, received the same pension payments, the same widow's housing, the same estate support as every other worker killed in every other explosion before and after them. Alexis's death did not make the 6 workers' deaths more important. The system treated them as it always had. But here's the twist that history holds quietly. Alexis DuPont's death also did not change the system. There was no policy review that removed family members from dangerous operations. No safety overhaul triggered by the loss of a family heir. No architectural redesign of the mill that killed him. The ground kept receiving what the work required it to receive. 58 years after Alexis died in that room, 30 more men died 200 feet away. The room had been repaired. The mill had been running. The ledger had been updated, and then closed, and then opened again for the next entry. But perhaps the strangest thing found under the DuPont estate in 1915 was not a room, or a tunnel, or a record. It was a technology. One that, by the standards of the era, should not have existed on the property of a family still manufacturing 19th century gunpowder. Number 6. The machine basement out of time. In 1910, Alfred DuPont had technology the country didn't know existed yet. Let's return to Nemours. The year Alfred I DuPont completed his 77-room French palace on 300 acres of walled Delaware land, 5 years before the explosion that would draw the world's attention back to what the family had built. In 1910, the average American home did not have reliable electricity. Refrigeration, as a domestic technology, was years away from widespread adoption. Central heating systems were primitive, temperamental, and rare outside of major commercial buildings. Below the Nemours mansion, in a basement that visitors never saw and servants navigated by memory, Alfred DuPont had installed all 3, not as novelties, as infrastructure. The electrical system powering Nemours was not a demonstration project or a luxury accessory. It was a comprehensive, engineered installation designed to run a 77-room residence around the clock. The refrigeration units, cutting edge in 1910, were large enough to service the estate's full food storage and kitchen operations. The heating plant was sized for a building that required climate control across multiple wings in Delaware winters. But the technology most worth noting was the hidden one: the tunnel. The underground laundry passage at Nemours was not a random engineering choice. It was the application of a specific philosophy to a physical problem. The problem: servants carrying laundry across the lawn are visible. Visibility disrupts the aesthetic unity of the estate. The aesthetic unity of the estate communicates something about the family that owns it. The solution? Put the movement underground. What Alfred DuPont had built in 1910 was a technology stack designed not to demonstrate what was possible, but to make certain kinds of work and certain kinds of people disappear from the surface of his property. In 1915, when investigators stood above the ruins of the packing house on the Brandywine and looked up at the mansion on the hill, perfectly intact, 200 feet away from where 30 men had just died, they were seeing the same principle expressed in a different medium. The machinery that moved the estate's violence away from the family's visibility had been working perfectly. The mansion remained beautiful. The basement remained hidden. The servants remained underground. The mill workers remained on the wrong side of the wooden wall. And the family remained on the hill. 6 items in, and we have found tunnels, ledgers, architectural engineering, and a system of dependency so complete it encompassed housing, education, and burial. But the 7th thing they found in 1915, the one that took the longest to surface, and the one that explains everything else, was not physical at all. Number 7. The inheritance of invisibility. The real secret was never underground. It was the system that put everything else there. In the years following 1915, as the United States moved through World War I, during which the DuPont company supplied an estimated 40% of all Allied gunpowder, the family transitioned. The Brandywine powder mills would close permanently in 1921. The family's industrial interests would diversify. Chemicals, synthetic materials, eventually nylon, neoprene, Teflon, and Kevlar. The DuPonts would remain one of the wealthiest families in American history for the rest of the century. The estates remained. Eleutherian Mills, the original home above the powder yards, is now a museum. The Hagley Museum and Library. The powder yards are preserved. The worker houses are marked. The stone mill buildings with their 3 walls and their missing wooden fourth sides still stand along the Brandywine, facing the river in the same direction they always faced. Nemours Estate is open for tours. Visitors walk through 77 rooms. They are shown the formal gardens, the reflecting pool, the carriage house, the original automobiles. The tunnel is still there. The mechanical basement is still there. But here is what the 1915 investigation ultimately revealed, not immediately, not in the newspaper coverage of the explosion, but in the longer history that the explosion helped expose. The DuPont family had not invented something dark. They had perfected something ordinary. The principle that makes dangerous work invisible, that puts the labor underground and keeps the ownership above ground, was not a DuPont innovation. It was the organizing logic of the Gilded Age, executed by one family with unusual consistency, unusual precision, and unusual longevity. What was found under the DuPont estate in 1915 was not a secret room or a buried vault or a document containing evidence of something criminal. What was found was a system where the house stayed on the hill, the blast went toward the river, the servants moved through tunnels, the widows received their pensions, the ledgers were kept in fireproof boxes, and the men who died in the packing house were entered, accurately, precisely in the company's own handwriting, into a record that no one outside the estate was ever meant to read. 288 explosions, 228 dead, 119 years, and a mansion on a hill that never once felt the shockwave. The most frightening thing about what was found under the DuPont estate is not that it was hidden. It is that most of it was never hidden at all. It was in the architecture, in the property records, in the pension ledgers, in the stone walls and the wooden walls and the direction they faced. It was in plain sight for anyone willing to look at what was underneath and ask why it was designed to flow in only one direction. 7 things found under the DuPont estate in 1915. A mansion engineered to survive what it could not avoid. A subterranean world of tunnels, technology, and invisible labor. A ledger of 288 explosions recorded with bureaucratic precision. A company town where even the grief was company property. A room where a DuPont died, and the mills reopened on schedule. A mechanical basement running technology the country hadn't caught up to yet. And underneath all of it, a system so consistent, so deliberately constructed that it persisted for over a century without ever needing to be called a secret. Because the most durable secrets are not the ones locked in vaults. They are the ones written into the ground itself, into the direction a wall faces, into the route a tunnel takes, into whose name is at the top of the ledger and whose is at the bottom. The powder mills are silent now. The Brandywine flows the same way it always has. The wooden fourth walls are long gone, replaced by the open air of a museum property where schoolchildren walk on Saturday mornings. But the stone walls are still there. And if you stand in the right place and look at which direction they face, you will understand, without anyone having to tell you, everything about how power works when no one is watching. Write in the comments, which of the 7 discoveries changed the way you see this story? And if you could read one of those private DuPont ledgers, which year would you turn to first? Subscribe. Because the ground under every great estate has more than one story, and most of them have never been told.